صباح الخير. صباح الخير، أرجو من الجميع الجلوس. قبل البدء بالجلسة العامة لدينا تعليمين أو 3 تعليمات سريعة، ولكن قبل التعليمات خلونا نمر فقط عبر الأجندة لليوم الثاني. سنبدأ الآن بالجلسة العامة وهي جلسة اقتصادية ستركز على وجهات نظر يمنية ودولية حول تحولات سياسات المساعدات الدولية والانتقال الاقتصادي، ما هو وضع الاقتصاد اليوم. بعد ذلك سنذهب إلى استراحة. بعد الاستراحة سنذهب إلى جلسات موازية، سيكون لدينا 3 جلسات موازية، أحدهما مركزة على النفط والغاز، والأخرى على العدالة الانتقالية والحفاظ على مبادئ العدالة الأساسية، والجلسة الأخيرة ستكون حول الطاقة المتجددة. عقب ذلك سنذهب إلى جلسة عامة أخرى ستركز على العدالة الانتقالية، وبعد البريك سنذهب إلى 3 جلسات موازية، وسننتهي إن شاء الله على 5:30. تذكير: اليوم سيكون لدينا الريسبشن في هذه القاعة التي يستضيفها السفارة الهولندية. 5:30 الجميع يقدروا يروحوا للغرف يرتاحوا ويغيروا، ولكن نتمنى من الجميع أن يكونوا في القاعة على الساعة 6:15 6:30
but please be in the hall 6:15. 6:30 the reception will start. Just a general session yesterday. In the parallel sessions, taking photographs is strictly prohibited. This is other than the panel session. Panel session, you can take photographs, no problem, but in parallel session, it is strictly prohibited to take pictures because they are all managed under the Chatham House rules so that the discussions are more effective, more open. Please refrain from taking pictures and refrain from communicating what took place in the session. Outside on the screens there are barcodes. You can take pictures of them and then you'll have the agenda on your phone, so you don't need to every once in a while go to update. You'll receive it on WhatsApp. The barcode will send you to WhatsApp. And then you'll find it, and then in front of each room you're going to see what is the session that is being held in that room from the morning until the end of the day. Thank you very much, and I hand over the mic now to our colleague Jihan. For those who need to put on headphones, please put them on. The session will be run in English.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you all and welcome our distinguished panelists. If anybody wants to wear their... Oh, okay. Can we get the... Okay. Yeah, that's... well, not everybody they speak English. Okay, good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all and welcome our distinguished panelists to our session today. I am Jihan Abdul Ghaffar. I am an international development expert, and I'll be moderating this session on the Yemeni and international perspectives, addressing aid policy shifts and economic transition. As we all know, Yemen is facing a severe humanitarian and development crisis driven by complex political instability and geopolitics tensions. Since 2015, Yemen real GDP per capita has declined by 54%. Meanwhile, inflation, currency depreciation, and fiscal deficit have worsened poverty and food insecurity. The detention of aid and development workers further disrupts essential services. These interconnected challenges have deepened Yemen's reliance on foreign aid. This session brings together key stakeholders to assess how Yemen's needs align with the challenged aid landscape, identify strategies, including localization, to address development challenges, and explore the role of the private sector in economic resilience. We'll begin with key questions to our panelists before opening the floor for Q&A. Please keep responses to 5 minutes if possible. But let me start first with introducing our distinguished panelists. I'm gonna start from the far. Iman Shanqaiti, the UN OCHA Deputy Humanitarian Coordinator in Yemen and a senior emergency health professional with extensive experience in conflict zones. Iman serves as WHO's emergency coordinator in Sudan and Afghanistan, and as the emergency operation manager in the health emergencies programs. Welcome. Mazen Aman is a senior business development and economic advisor. He's an expert in private sector and development and a member of the economic reform team, a forum of business leaders dedicated to exploring economic solutions to inform and enhance government effort and policies. Dina Abu Ghaida is the World Bank Group country manager for Yemen since 2024. Prior to this, Dina served as the Human Development Program leader for Iran, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, where she coordinated the World Bank policy dialogue and operations in education, health, and social protection. In her previous role as lead economist in the Education Global Practice, she led policy dialogue and World Bank support for the education sector in Nigeria, Jordan, and Yemen. Nadia Al-Saqaf is a prominent Yemeni scholar and journalist who promotes women's rights, press freedoms, and sustainable social and environmental development in Yemen. She served for a short time as a Minister of Information in the Yemeni government and was longtime editor-in-chief of the prominent English language newspaper Yemen Times. She's currently a researcher with the 21st Century Forum based in the UK. She has a PhD in politics from University of Reading in the United Kingdom. Charles Harbour, the Development Director and Deputy Ambassador to Yemen since 2019. Previously, Charles served as the head of DFID, Jordan, interim head of the Finance and Control Department in Whitehall, and deputy head of DFID's private sector department. Before joining DFID, he worked at the Ministry of Defense, where he completed several postings in the Middle East. Welcome to you all. Maybe, Charles, I will start with you. As Yemen's growing reliance on donors and development partners heightens its vulnerability to shifts in the global aid architecture. Geopolitical changes, shifting donor priorities, and crisis fatigue, if we could call them that, are straining aid resources, while rising global demands from complex natural disasters and other development needs put more pressure on concessional financing and especially grant funding. What recent shifts do you observe within the donor community, and how is the UK responding to that in the case, of course, of Yemen?
Thank you very much, and apologies. I'll be speaking in English. I'd love to be able to speak to you in Arabic, but I think it might be a very confusing conversation if I did that. Well, let me start with the first part of that question about what are some of the shifts in the donor community. And I think a lot of this will be familiar to everybody in this room, but let me just run through that and summarize some of it. I mean, we've obviously had the recent events coming out of America. We've had the 90-day pause from US aid. It's not clear at this stage how that's going to play out, both across the world, but also for Yemen. Aid may return. It may return with some exemptions or constraints. But I think one of the important things for us to be doing as a donor community is considering all of the eventualities of that and planning for them. Similarly, again, from the United States, we've had the FTO designation of the Houthis. At this stage, we don't know whether that will come with general licenses or whether general licenses will be issued to support both humanitarian and commercial imports into the country. But either way, with or without general licenses, that is bound to have a significant impact across the whole of Yemen. There will be a chilling effect, as we've seen in other countries where terrorist designations get put in place. I also think, specifically in the north, that the operating environment is becoming very, very difficult. We've seen a series of detentions there. This has caused a reassessment by the donor community in terms of how it can operate there, and obviously working very closely with the United Nations and other delivery partners, we've concluded that at the moment all we can deliver in the north is life-saving and life-sustaining support to the people of Yemen there. From a UK perspective, we don't do development in the north of Yemen. We only do humanitarian support. But again, development now has stopped in the whole of the north of Yemen as a consequence of the situation around the detention. So I think that's a very big shift and a serious one for the 70% of the Yemeni population who live in the north of the country. Donor fatigue was also mentioned, I think, in the introduction. Western economies are under pressure. There's a shifting political landscape right across the world, and I think that is also impacting in terms of some of the donor responses to Yemen. We also have the regional situation, again, which all of you in this room will be as familiar with me as me with. Syria, Gaza, and indeed, there are huge humanitarian demands in parts of East Africa as well, such as Sudan, South Sudan, and areas such as this. So we have an extremely challenging situation on the ground across many parts of the world and specifically in Yemen. In terms of the second part of the question, how has the UK evolved its strategy to Yemen? Well, in some ways, we haven't evolved our strategy in any negative way at this stage. The first thing that has happened recently is we've actually increased our aid budget to Yemen. It's now 144 million pounds this financial year. That is probably the third largest aid program that the UK, that the FCDO does after Ukraine and Afghanistan. So Yemen is our biggest commitment, and our ministers are hugely committed to engaging on Yemen and supporting the people of Yemen. I think the UK is probably in the top 4 donors to Yemen at the moment. So in some senses, we haven't evolved other than just increase our response. But what the UK needs to do, and I think what other donors need to do, is because of these challenging circumstances, there are some really basic things that we need to make sure that we concentrate on. One is around coordination, making sure that as the donor community we coordinate really, really well together, we avoid overlaps and we avoid gaps, and that we've got a really coherent response and an agile response that can react quickly to the situation on the ground, particularly where we see pockets of humanitarian need increasing in certain areas. I think the other thing that we should be doing is working very, very closely with our delivery partners, whether that be the NGO community, the national NGO community, the UN, or others, to make sure that we are, again, really responding quickly and coordinating fast to respond to things. We should also be doing more joint programming, both together but also as a donor community, we should be reaching out to regional countries here in the Middle East to make sure that we are sharing our expertise and looking for opportunities where we can work together more effectively to support Yemen. So I think, in summing up, I would say, in terms of how we need to shift, we need to work more closely together. We need to maximize the impact of what we're trying to do in the country. But perhaps the most important thing that we need to do, and I haven't mentioned it so far, is actually listen to the Yemeni people so we understand what you need, and we can listen to your expertise so we can adapt our response accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. And given that word humanitarian kept coming up in your response, Charles, I will go to Iman, and maybe it's the same question to you, Iman. In terms of the shift in global aid architecture, how is this affecting OCHA's work, and how you're also shifting your response in Yemen?
Thank you, Jihan, and I will build on what Charles started with. First, yes, there's shifts, but these shifts have been happening for the last couple of years. It's not, maybe the recent events is a major shift, but there has been shifts that have been happening for the last couple of years. Also, it's important to note that despite these shifts, last year, our humanitarian response plan was 50 or 55% funded, which is considered to be a very good percentage among other emergency countries. What's important to note is that, as Charles mentioned, there's a lot of crises around us, and the attention towards Yemen is waning because of there's so many crises that needs to be addressed by so many donors. So for OCHA and for what we do, and the coordination, as you said, Charles, is going to be key, is really to look at what we do best and how we can bring new partners or new partnerships. And this is where it's really great to have on this panel development partners and emergency humanitarian partners, and of course the presence of our Yemeni colleagues, where we can bridge this gap and make sure that we complement each other rather than stepping on each other's foot. So what's important here is the collaboration, and to ensure that we are very effective and efficient on the ground. We can only do that if we do it together, if we're inclusive, and if we are strategic in our direction. For OCHA, definitely the shifts is impacting us or impacting our ability to operate on the ground, but we do what we always do, is we adapt and we focus on the people. So people-centered approach, and make sure that whatever we are doing is really contributing towards the welfare of the people. So I hope I managed to answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. And going from humanitarian to development, the World Bank Group has remained committed to development in Yemen. Its re-engagement in Yemen became a paradigm shift to the World Bank approach to working in countries in conflict. However, operating in conflict-affected countries present significant challenges in terms of operations, challenges and needs in general. So building on what Charles and Iman description of the situation, would like to hear from you, Dina, on how the World Bank is balancing these increasing development needs with the operation challenges and the resources available for Yemen, and what kind of instruments can the World Bank utilize to mobilize additional resources for Yemen?
Thank you very much. So for the World Bank, the support to Yemen is very important because, as Jihan has already said, our strategy on working in fragile countries has as a main pillar the notion of remaining engaged, not pulling out of a country because of conflict. Quite the contrary, to do our best to remain on the ground as much as possible with support across a whole range of sectors. In the case of Yemen, because there is not one government that is in control of the whole country, we work in very close partnership with the UN agencies. Iman and I talk to each other all the time because those UN agencies have presence throughout Yemen, and so our financing goes as grant funding to the UN agencies who then implement on the ground. The important aspect to keep in mind here, though, is that we really stress the need to work with institutions in Yemen as much as possible, so that the UN then partners with institutions like the Social Fund for Development, or the Public Works Program, or the Rural Access Program, or the Road Maintenance Fund. All of these are Yemeni institutions that have been in place for decades in some cases, and they provide then the actual services on the ground. Our funding comes from the International Development Association, IDA, which is a pot of money that is for low-income countries or countries in fragile settings. And every 3 years, this pot of money gets replenished. We go out and we seek more funds from the donors out there. And just this past December, we managed to secure, actually also with Jihan's help, who is a key member of the IDA committee, $100 billion for all countries that are low income. And so there will be an allocation again for the coming 3 years for Yemen. We expect it's going to be roughly the same as Yemen received the last 3 years. And so we will be able to maintain our support for Yemen, and we don't foresee a reduction from our side. Now, of course, we all are aware of the politics that are happening more recently now, specifically as related to the United States and the funding that the United States is or is not providing to international organizations moving forward. Of course, the United States is also a contributor to IDA. We have received no indication that the United States is in any way not continuing its support to IDA. So far, everything is on track. Of course, you know, we are monitoring the situation. And even if the United States were to reduce its support, this has actually happened in the past. The US share is not that large that it would dramatically impact the IDA envelope. But, you know, again, nothing is clear yet. There are so far no indications in terms of a reduction. The only thing that I want to highlight at this point is that the World Bank is very keen on supporting all Yemenis who are in need, regardless where they live in Yemen. And that, as Charles mentioned, we do see negative trends in terms of our ability to work in the areas controlled by the Houthi movement. As we all know, there have been recent detentions of UN colleagues, even the death of a UN colleague, and all of this is not conducive to continuing to operate in those areas, and whatever impacts the UN impacts the World Bank, because the UN are our main partners in implementing on the ground in Yemen. So we are watching those developments very, very closely as well.
Thank you. And given that there is a common theme here regarding serving all of Yemen, or of the Yemeni people, and listening to the Yemeni people, I would like to shift to Nadia now. As we all know, Nadia, that locally led development is a journey in all countries, and it presents both opportunities and challenges, and Yemen is no different. How do you define localization in the Yemeni context, and what are the key challenges and opportunities in empowering Yemenis to lead the development efforts?
Thank you, Jihan. بس تسمحكم بتكلم بالإنجليزي. I'll be speaking in English because my message, I was torn between speaking in English and Arabic, but my message is towards the international community, so I landed up speaking in English, so استسمحكم. So before I define localization, where whatever that may be, or if it does really exist in Yemen, I like to use a metaphor. And this metaphor is like, imagine Yemen as a child, and imagine the international community as a parent. And I'm going to say a parent, not a foster parent, not a stepmom, because I think the international community cares. I'm not thinking that they are evil, so in terms of how they are nurturing or taking care of Yemen. So there is firstly the child is before 2014 or 2015, so there is relative stability. And this international community, this mom, is taking care of this child. And this child is a bit rebellious, monopolizing, tension grabbing, between quotes, terrorism card or anything like that, trying to get away with doing things not the right way. And the international community or the mom is trying to say, do this the right way, this is a reform. And eventually this child is growing up to be functional, but not the best child, but somehow is able to do things. So this is the state that we had before 2014, in a way. Then there was another child, and this other child is the product of the conflict, somehow. And now the international community is more like a helicopter mom, so it's kind of freaking out, doesn't know how to act, and it's kind of overdoing things for this child, because this child is born with a disease, with a sickness, and so it's kind of, I'll feed you, no, I'll take care of you, I'll change your diapers. So now it's been, let's say, 10 years, and now we have a 10-year-old boy, let's call him a boy, and he's unable to change himself, he's unable to feed himself, and he still has the sickness. And suddenly, this mom is taken away. Suddenly, this care that was given to this child is reduced. And we know this is happening because the aid is being reduced in the Houthi-controlled areas, or the FTO in general on Yemen. So suddenly, there is no care, and the child is dysfunctional. So it's like, Mom, don't go. And this is what the international community has done. The dependency that was created on aid, in a way that it has reduced even the slightest ability of the Yemeni institutions and the Yemeni local actors to take care of themselves. And I'm saying your heart is in the right place, don't get me wrong. It's just you have gone the wrong way. And the reduction of aid is not a surprise. I mean, why would you ever think that aid would continue for Yemen for all of these years? It's a chronic emergency. I mean, the role of parents, and you all are parents, I mean, hopefully, is that you want to be redundant. You want a day would come that your child is able to take care of themselves. What the international community has done for Yemen is you've created this child who's dependent on you, and you let them fend for themselves when things became tough. And you knew this child was growing. And you knew that you're not going to be there forever. So in a nutshell, localization is enabling the partner, between quotes, because so far Yemenis are not considered partners, they're considered implementers or beneficiaries, to be able to take over for a time when you do not exist. And that does not happen. Even today, when Charles, Iman, and Dina are talking about coordination, talking about empowering, even the word empowering, I take offense in that. Like, we should think about it as, you know, we have skills, you have skills, let's work together. So, with the next round, I will bring more positive stuff, but for now, it's kind of, you know, don't come talk to me about coordinations, collaborations, you're not even talking to each other, let alone talking to us. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Nadia. I think I think going from partnerships with the Yemeni people, who are actually the ones who should be leading their development agenda, to partnership with the private sector, which is the engine of economic growth in countries. In Yemen, it has faced immense pressure, but has remained a crucial pillar in supporting the resilience of the Yemeni economy. Mazen, how is the private sector coping with the challenges facing the country, and how can its role in the development agenda be strengthened? And maybe you could give us some examples of some of these private sector initiatives that you and others are working on.
Thank you, Jihan. Allow me, I will speak in Arabic.
Sure.
Okay, at least some of them will get the relief of the speakers from their heads. Okay. شكرا. والمقدمة اللي تفضلت بها بالفعل هو القطاع الخاص هو المحرك الرئيسي لأي تنمية، تمام، في الدول العالم، تمام. والتحديات والفترة التي مر فيها القطاع الخاص، وأنا هنا لا أتحدث فقط بداية من 2015 بل حتى من قبل ذلك، تمام. التحديات دائما كانت كبيرة بالنسبة لليمن، والقطاع الخاص يمكن هو القطاع الوحيد اللي في اليمن الذي استطاع
that has proven completely and has been able to remain resilient on the ground. And even today, everyone sees that the private sector is the only sector that continues to be, to a certain extent, relatively unified throughout Yemen, regardless of the challenges, regardless of the crises, the political crisis, and the conflict in the country that that the people as a whole are suffering from. But the private sector is still resilient and has proven its flexibility and ability to adapt with rapidly shifting conditions and the challenges that crop up every day, whether these are local challenges, regional challenges, or international challenges. Change on a daily basis. The fuel and the availability of fuel changes on a daily basis. It might be here today and not here tomorrow. The fluctuating exchange rates, these are all changes that the private sector faces, and these are all challenges that do not end. But despite this, the private sector is still resilient and is still able to provide for society. I don't know if some of you know this, but the private sector is still responsible for more than or around 90% of the incoming food into the country. The international community, with all of the organizations working, the food organizations, in the best case scenario, when there was funding from donors, larger amounts of funding in 2017 and 2018 specifically, but even in its best case, in the pinnacle of the funding that was provided or allocated for Yemen, the international community and international organizations were not able to provide more than 10 to 12% of the food required in the country. The private sector continued, despite these challenges, and continued to be the sector that was responsible for providing this. The same applies to medicine. With agriculture, 100% of the agriculture is from the private sector in Yemen. And it's true that I represent the private sector. My background is in the private sector, but I think this is the reality, and it's been proven over the years. We've always said we thank God that the private sector is responsible for food, and that's why the import of food has not been cut off from Yemen. We have not reached a point where bread is unavailable in the country because the private sector did not rely on food aid, but was able to provide it. What Nadia mentioned is something that we warned about a lot. This model, this approach that has been used since the beginning of the crisis in 2015, the approach that has been used with relief and aid assistance to Yemen, this approach might have been suitable if the crisis lasted maybe for a year. And we had always warned that the time will come where the world and donors will have other crises. Other crises will start around the world. And Yemen, which had been a priority or was presented as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, it seems like last year, other crises came and took that away and became the worst humanitarian crises. And so the main focus has always been on humanitarian assistance. And this is, if we say an example, these aren't real figures. If we say 20% in Yemen in 2015 were living under the poverty line, and humanitarian assistance was being provided to clothe and feed them, this support, unfortunately, did not create real and new working opportunities. There is no humanitarian assistance that creates development and work opportunities. Development is what leads to work opportunities. Humanitarian support does not. And so the 20% became 30%, and then 40%. These are people living in poverty, and then 50%. This means that there's a necessity for continued humanitarian assistance. And this is the model that is being used by organizations that were responsible for the Yemeni file. And unfortunately, we always talk about humanitarian assistance and development, but the real focus has always been on humanitarian assistance. And for this reason, we ignored development. We ignored even the organizations even ignored having the private sector as their real partner for them on the ground, because the model or the approach that they are using does not align with this approach. And international organizations and humanitarian organizations should have changed and shifted this approach, the one that has been used, that might have been successful in smaller contexts, in contexts where crises were not likely to end anytime soon. But this approach should have changed to be more appropriate for Yemen.
Mazen, maybe if you could add or maybe share with us, with the challenges, we keep having new and new challenges that will have an impact on the private sector. And we hear about the FTO. I know we don't have much information about the FTO, but what could be a message from you in terms of how we could at least enable the private sector to continue doing its work? Of course, we don't know what's going to entail in the FTO, but maybe a message from the private sector on that.
لن أتحدث كثيرا عن زي ما تفضلتي عن موضوع التصنيف في الاف تي او كده، لأنه أصلا ما زال زي ما تحدثنا أمس في جلستنا المغلقة أنه ما زال هذا يكنفه كثير من الغموض بالنسبة للتوضيح ما هي. تمام، لكن سأعطيك مثلا بعض الأمثلة لكيف ممكن مرونة
of how the flexibility and adaptability of the private sector, not just in the field of development, but even in the field of humanitarian assistance. During COVID, and this was an international crisis, it was not a local crisis, it was not a regional one, it was an international one, and even donors and organizations had to deal with too many challenges that they had to deal with because of the COVID crisis. And in Yemen, we were thinking about who would do anything, who would provide support. We contacted the World Health Organization to try to understand their assessment of the situation. It was a disastrous situation at the time, that the healthcare centers or clinics throughout the governorates in the north, east, and south did not even have ventilators. They did not have the testing equipment. Even the very basic equipment, the preventative equipment, was not available. And so who is going to be working on this and providing this? Everyone was busy with trying to deal with this crisis in their country and in their region. At the time, we in the private sector, led by the Hayy Said Group, contacted international companies like Unilever, like Tetra Pak, and also in coordination with the World Health Organization and in coordination with the Federation of Chambers of Commerce and the Chamber of Commerce in Aden. And we established what was called at the time the COVID Protection Initiative for Yemen. And with the support of the private sector, led by the Hayy Said Group, and international partners or international firms also worked with us on this. And we provided rapid assistance, and through our commercial ties with other states and companies, we're able to get the necessary equipment, like the ventilators, like the PCR tests, like the protective equipment, and airlifts. There were 3 private planes that were moved to Yemen, and we cooperated with the World Health Organization and the Ministry of Health and its various institutions, because the basis for our intervention was we wanted to ensure that this equipment and that these needs would actually reach the healthcare centers and clinics that had been supported by the World Health Organization, so that there is no potential corruption. And when we look back at that period, the period when we were able to operate rapidly, how many people were we able to save with these efforts and this initiative? Also, since last year, in cooperation with UNICEF, we provided a program to provide fortified milk that is fortified with vitamins, to schools. After the UNICEF reports showed that more than 2 million children in Yemen, 50% of Yemen's children are facing malnutrition. And around 500,000 are suffering from wasting. And Yemen is one of the countries with the highest rates of wasting among children. This was an initiative from the private sector, from the Hayy Said Group, alongside UNICEF, Tetra Pak, an international firm, to support and finance, and even in cooperation with the Humanitarian Development Foundation as an NGO. We provided this milk in packets that could handle the environment in Yemen and the fact that they will not be cooled during their supply chain, and provide them to the schools. And with our work with an international organization, FPRI, which is an organization that assesses food policies around the world, they conducted a survey from before the initiative, and a few months later, at the end of last year, they conducted another survey to truly assess whether there was an impact, a positive impact on the children themselves in the schools. And so there's a lot that we can do as the private sector, is my answer to that.
There is a common trend here that there is a need to shift from humanitarian to development. We need to create jobs. We need to reduce that dependency on aid. So the question to you, Dina, how can the World Bank Group actually support this public-private partnerships and come up with those solutions to leverage Yemen's opportunities and address its development challenges?
Thank you. For us at the World Bank, the way we see our current support is in the line of, we don't see sort of a dichotomy between humanitarian and development. We think of it more as a continuum. I don't like the word nexus. We don't think of it as a humanitarian development nexus. It's a continuum. So if there are multiple World Bank projects that support the health sector, and the health sector, hospitals in particular, are in dire need of fuel supplies. So you could say this is a humanitarian intervention. I would tell you that maybe, but it's also a development intervention, because when you support hospitals, you support the health of the population, you are preserving the human capital of the population, you are helping Yemenis stay healthy and reach their economic and jobs potential. So just to make that sort of something that we all think about maybe as we move forward. And our current support includes education, health, but also agriculture, small farmers. We support roads, we support energy, renewable solar panels. We have projects that work in fisheries. We have projects that support microfinance for women and men entrepreneurs. So development is already happening. I don't think it's accurate to think of the support that the international community is providing now as being purely humanitarian, in my humble opinion. We already are doing a lot, as much as we can, on development. Now, in terms of the public-private partnership, this is an excellent question, because I cannot agree more with Mazen that the private sector in Yemen has been impressive, spectacularly resilient, and the country's needs are so huge that there is no amount of World Bank or FCDO or any donor funding that could possibly provide Yemen with all the funds that it needs for future development. You already actually have remittances that come in that are more than all of the foreign aid combined. So you already have that. And then you have the resilient private sector. And for the World Bank Group, and I am actually country manager both for the World Bank as well as the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which works with the private sector. Every time we see a problem, our first question is, what is the development solution here? Is it something that requires public funds, or is it actually something where the private sector can come in, or is it a situation of a public-private partnership? And then we work with it depending on what we think is the right answer for this. So the IFC is actually an investor in Hayal Said, for example, and the IFC is constantly looking for new investment opportunities in Yemen. The problem is that the private sector looks at Yemen and sees a very risky environment, so they want some sort of guarantees. Often in a public-private partnership, those guarantees come from the government. We all know that the government does not have the money. It can barely pay its own civil servants, so it cannot provide those guarantees to the private sector. So the IFC is working to find other sources of funds, maybe from regional partners, that will allow this de-risking for the private sector, so that the private sector can come and invest in Yemen more than it currently does. And we are also, thinking here of not, of course, any private sector anywhere in the world, but a lot of our focus has been on trying to bring those Yemeni business women and businessmen who are in the diaspora, who are outside Yemen, who could be maybe the first ones who will be able to come back, and who will maybe be able to absorb the risk a bit better because they know the country better, they know exactly how things work. So it's an ongoing effort, and it's really a key pillar of what we strive to do for the country's development moving forward.
Thank you, Dina. And back to you, Charles. We hear about the importance of the development agenda. Of course, humanitarian is also important, but there is this call for focusing more on looking at what are the opportunities there for these kind of partnerships in the country. Wondering what the UK, in terms of its aid development policy, how is it aligned with your diplomatic and political engagement in Yemen, and what are the steps taken by the UK to support development agenda in the country?
Great. Thank you very, very much. So I hear what previous speakers have said about the need to start to and continue to address some of the underlying problems inside Yemen. I mean, we absolutely have to move away from humanitarian assistance and start moving into institutional reform and sectoral reform and more fundamental forms of development. But it is very, very difficult to do that, even if we have to accept that we have built a reliance on humanitarian aid, as you've quite rightly challenged us, Nadia. Because we have a large part of the population, 17 million people, who don't have enough food to eat. And we cannot just switch overnight and stop supporting those people, particularly women and children. And it's a big part of our humanitarian program to continue to support people in need. And that humanitarian imperative has always been a big part of how the FCDO operates. And it's worth me saying that is entirely apolitical. It doesn't bend with the political context within a country. The issue is making sure that we support those who are most in need. And I've already spoken about the fact that a large part of our support to Yemen is in that humanitarian space. But having said that, I completely understand the thesis that we need to move away from the symptom and start tackling the underlying causes of the problem. I mean, within our humanitarian aid, as Dina says, it's not just pure humanitarian. We're doing livelihoods, we're doing early recovery, we're supporting institutions like the Social Fund for Development, we're providing cash for work, cash for transfers, all things which are sort of trying to build up and increase the independence of the individuals inside the country. And we will have to continue to do that for some years to come. I think that is the reality of the situation. When it comes to development and building governance and institutional reform inside Yemen, yes, we are absolutely moving into that space, and we have been for several years. But it is challenging. I mean, we were really pleased to see the government of Yemen setting out its 2-year and 5-year priority plan in recent months, and there have been several meetings around that this week to try and come together to make sure that we are fully aligned in terms of how we respond to that request. We've also set up a technical assistance fund, which is designed to provide capacity building, technical assistance and support to institutions inside Yemen to support them. And that's designed to work very, very quickly, very, very flexibly, and act as a catalyst to bringing in more support from elsewhere. We were a founder member of the World Bank Trust Fund, and we work very closely with the World Bank and Dina to make sure that we are leveraging off the expertise of the World Bank so that UK funding can support institutions. And we've also recently engaged very closely with the International Monetary Fund. Our ambassador went to Washington a couple of weeks ago to begin to provide the political impetus to getting the IMF to engage more closely with Yemen, with the hope that eventually we can start up a new Article 4 process, which will give Yemen ultimately more access to international funding, which would support this development agenda. So these are just some of the things that we are doing at the moment. And I think this will take time, but I think there is appetite across the donor community to recognize that we need to be giving a lot more support to the government in the south, recognizing again, though, that challenge, that humanitarian challenge, is going to stay there for some time. Thank you.
With this note that humanitarian challenges will stay with us for some time, and hopefully in the near future we'll be able to speak about a different kind of agenda for Yemen, an economic agenda for Yemen. But Iman, back to you in terms of hearing all of these challenges, and I'm sure there are other challenges maybe we didn't have a chance to discuss here, but what kind of partnerships are you building in Yemen to support your humanitarian work?
Thank you so much for all speakers and for Jihan for putting this on the table. First of all, I've been in Yemen for the last 6 months, and during the visits I've had to the field and meeting communities, meeting people, all of them said, we don't want the food basket, we want economic empowerment opportunities. This has been very consistent. And again, meeting the government officials, this was also a consistent message. I've worked in several countries, and in many countries I've been dealing with private sector, but from different perspectives. So philanthropists, private individuals, and so on. But I think Yemen has a very unique opportunity. First of all, it has a very strong, resilient private sector. And additionally, they have the backup from GCC. The families that are residing in GCC, and they are sending all the remittances, as Dina said. These are quite important. And maybe just to highlight, I'm happy that Mazen is here. Last week we signed a letter of intent together with Hayy Said. It was signed between the resident coordinator and Hayy Said Anam Group. And the whole idea of this, it's not a financial transaction. It's more of an understanding how to build a network of private investors or private sector who would like to invest more in Yemen, and bringing people from outside the country, not only people from inside the country. So it's more of a letter of understanding, of partnership. And of course, we do realize that the private sector is a very strong partner and needs to be seen as a partner also, not only as a subcontractor in rebuilding Yemen. This will help us be leaner, faster. It will help us in being an ally that could defend the case that we have on the ground. So this is from my perspective, and I feel that the private sector is a partner, and we should be working very closely together. And that started with a partnership with Hayy Said, but we intend to build on this partnership with other. The main theme for such a partnership is to adopt an area-based approach and focus on the most vulnerable in these areas and give them some sort of an economic empowerment opportunities for them to graduate from an emergency humanitarian situation into a more sustainable situation. What Mazen said in terms of COVID, I think this partnership is something that we have seen in many countries, and it was really great. The partnership that the private sector had, I was in Lebanon at that time, the partnership that we had, the private sector together with the health sector, really enabled the country to move forward and to be able to respond as quickly as possible. He also mentioned something on malnutrition, and I think this is an important example, because this is where the humanitarian and the development context mix. Responding to malnutrition is a humanitarian case. You need to provide the support for them, for the children and the mothers and so on. But the underlying causes are systematic. It's structurally systematic. Economic situation, the situation of water, the situation of the sewage, all contribute to the increase in malnutrition. So I agree with Dina that I don't like this shift. I mean, this split humanitarian development, because they are really all contributing toward one cause. And I think one of the things that we always claim and we always value is that the do no harm business. And I hear you very well, Nadia, in terms of the creating of dependency. But I think it's important to note that all humanitarian programs and funding are there to stop people from dying. But it's not meant to build on more developmental programs. So it's important that both channels go in parallel in order for us to have something which is long-lasting and sustained. Thank you.
And thank you. And we heard about, of course, partnership with the private sector, but I don't want to forget about the civil society. And it will be good to hear about your partnership with civil society in Yemen. So if maybe you could reflect on that.
So I have been in Yemen, as I said, for the last 6 months. And together with the resident coordinator, we've been going to the field and meeting with the people. I mean, it's important to listen to them, to see what they want. I think we can do more, and in order to ensure that there's true partnership and that our plans and what we aim to do reflects what they want. And I hope that the partnership we're establishing with Hayal Said, because Hayal Said is not only a private sector, but they also have the NGO arm. Together with them and other families in Yemen, we could also engage more with the private, with the civil society and with the community in order to ensure that our plans are stratified towards their needs.
Thank you. Back to you, Mazen. And you just reflected on the relationship the private sector has with the international community in terms of maybe addressing COVID at that point. But there is a need to shift the narrative on Yemen, a narrative that reflect Yemen as a humanitarian crisis, maybe looks at Yemen from a security perspective only, and basically to keep Yemen alive on the agenda, especially with all these cases around us, maybe in the region, where attention could be shifted to other areas. What is your role as the private sector to build this case for Yemen during these challenges time, to shift to that kind of narrative?
بالنسبة لليمن موضوع
The issue
الدعم الإنساني
of humanitarian support
ما يسمى بالhumanitarian
and what is called humanitarian aid. Of course, this exists. This was there before 2015, before 2010. And unfortunately, in view of the circumstances that we are going through, it appears that it will also exist in the coming years. So what we're talking about is, we're not saying that we ban humanitarian assistance from Yemen. We can't say this. But the rhetoric that you were talking about, that we are in fact looking for, is that Yemen is not merely a humanitarian file, but rather it's much more than this in Yemen. There's more to this in Yemen, whether what we call human resources of Yemen, which are at the level of the human peninsula, the Arab Peninsula. It's the biggest human resources, capabilities, competencies that have been proven. Circumstances that Yemen has went through over the past decades have prevented, unfortunately, and limited any ability to develop in development, and therefore herein comes what Iman talked about, merging or integrating the need of Yemen for humanitarian aid and working actually with international partners, regional partners on development. And so, for example, if today Yemen has 40%, some reports say that there are about 40% of the population of Yemen are in need of humanitarian support. And so let us be sure first that any programs, any models that we design today and implement, they are first, we feed and provide food for the 40%, but at the same time, there is the parallel approach to this, so that the 40 becomes 30 and the 30 becomes 20 with continued humanitarian support. And this will never be achieved unless there are opportunities that are created, new job opportunities. Without creating new job opportunities for the population of Yemen, the 50 will become 60, and we all know Yemen was classified, I think, in the 90s as a fragile state, and then we transitioned into a failed state. And today, no state. And so where to now? And here, in fact, the narrative that you were talking about is, this is what we are seeking with our international partners, with our regional partners, with the public sector that still exists until today in Yemen. How this narrative of Yemen will change the story of Yemen from a humanitarian, strictly humanitarian security file to a file that is able to develop, that is able to create opportunities, job opportunities for its population with dignity.
I think this, the last word really hits a nerve here about the serving the Yemeni people with dignity. And going back to you, Nadia, on that point, how can we actually have localization be better integrated in both current and future aid strategies, ensuring that local actors have the necessary resources and decision-making power? I mean, this is an opportunity for you to share ideas with our development partners here, and for them to take it maybe forward in their thinking.
Thank you, Jihan, and previous speakers. Just a note on what has been said regarding the development and humanitarian dichotomy. It's because you created this dichotomy, and it's because there are different clusters. Like there is the humanitarian cluster, OCHA, and so on, and there is the development group, let's say, and the numbers don't lie. So yes, your heart is in the right place. I'm not questioning that. You're a mom. You're a loving, caring helicopter mom. But look at the numbers. Look at the percentages of how much is going towards humanitarian and how much is going towards development. Even the humanitarian part, some of it is going towards 1 year, and you're saying this is towards more livelihood and so on. So the shift is happening. It's just the baby, the child now is growing. So the needs are growing, and you're not building the immunity system of this child. So this is not a criticism, like in terms of pointing fingers. This is just saying, come on. Yeah, we have to, and everything that you're saying is in the right place. So we are in the same zone, let's say, but there are actionable, like there's a proverb in Arabic, I'm gonna say it, أسمع كلامك يعجبني أشوف أفعالك أستغرب. It's like, it's like walk the walk, don't just talk the talk, because the talk is right. So the first point is depoliticizing aid, depoliticizing development and infrastructure. We're talking about energy, electricity, communication. So everything that has to do with building Yemen up, that has to be depoliticized. So this is a part of the political aspects of it. So here is a cause. I'm handing this to you, DFID, the pen holder for Yemen. Please work on depoliticizing everything that's going to help the Yemen take care of itself. And then the other thing is we need a new quad. And this is a quad that's not a political one. This is donors, including humanitarian and OCHA, development. You need to talk to each other. I know you're best friends and so on, but like I'm saying, really, like Mazen was saying, baseline studies, where are we working? How can we better use resources effectively and so on. So there's the aspect of research. A lot of the documents as a researcher, I'm telling you, and I'm going to put a plug into a research I've done with the Sana'a Center, so go to the website and look at the localization study. It's all forecasting. A lot of it is forecasting. So because of legitimate logistical constraints, we're really not able. So let's seek assistance from the civil society, private sector, and even local authorities to gather data from the ground and get the real numbers. Because even the concept of 20% of Yemenis are in need of emergency food assistance, like I have a question there. We need to revisit that, see how much exactly it is and where exactly it is. Because there is a way. We are very resilient people. We kind of get things done. And the other, so Quad, yeah? So we have the internationals, the government. The government is not just ministers, and most of the ministers are abroad. We're also talking about local. So we're talking about local authorities and the people who are on the ground, who are able to, so this connection, so the different levels of authority. Private sector. And this private sector includes all private sectors in Houthi-controlled areas, in IRG areas. Because eventually, when we depoliticize development, we will be able to talk to each other, and civil society. And civil society also includes monitoring and observing accountability organizations and the implementing organizations, the Yemeni partners. So if we have this quad, and it has to be in an operational, kind of emergency operational room, this will speed up progress. It's like, okay, we can't have access to this area. What can we do about it? It's like a 24-hour emergency room, because this is an emergency. It's a chronic emergency, but we need to like feel it's an emergency, not wait a month before any meeting and coordination can happen. More practical points. So strengthening the local leadership and decision making by moving beyond subcontracting. So we're talking about partnerships. And these partnerships, I understand there are financial constraints in terms of your requirement as donors, because eventually you have to answer to your taxpayers, you have to answer to your donors. So you cannot just give money to the Yemeni government or the Yemeni local NGOs and say, do what you want, because you have to have auditing and so on. So there is an intermediate. The private sector has created a vision, the Yemeni Economic Reform Team, create a vision for an entity that can be in between. So that can, sort of a private sector approach towards development and humanitarian implementation, where they get the bids, the government facilitates, they ensure the implementation, and they send the reports. So these reports are up to your standards, but they know what's going on, and they can deal with the other logistical costs. They can address security constraints, operational costs, and so on. So hand over, delegate. Let the child start working and bringing, you know? Muscles, yeah. Let the Yemenis show off, yeah? And we will make mistakes, but let us make these mistakes. So this is in terms of the financial, shifting the financial power to the Yemenis as a trusted partner, and the final one, it has to do with the longer and flexible funding. So we have to think about 3 years, no less than 3 years projects, even with the humanitarian aspects. I hear you, Iman, but it's no longer, it's a chronic emergency. So maybe even if you're thinking about humanitarian interventions, it could be in the same region, in the same area, talking to the same community, a new project, but builds on what has been done before. Because so far from research, You go somewhere, you help a community for 6 months, they become dependent, you leave, you go next door, you help another community for 6 months. This has become dependent, and it's, you know, it's like the continuity of it. Even with humanitarian support, it keeps, because there's only so much you can do. I hear you. The need is so much, and the money is so little. But even with that, in Arabic, I'm sorry, في دار معمور ولا قرية خراب. I don't know if you know this. It's like, at least you have something that's working instead of, you know, jack of all, or what is it? Jack of all? Jack of all trades. Yeah. No, that's not it. What is it? A master of none? A jack of all, a master of none? Whatever, forget it. It's just like consistency and focusing on one area, building it strongly, and then this will cause a ripple effect, because people will gravitate towards that area because it becomes a success story, and then the resilience is going to be contagious. So there are solutions. Start with the depoliticizing, work on the new Quad, shift the financial power through intermediaries, and listen to the private sector, look at research, and more coordination, especially between the development and the humanitarian.
Thank you, Nadia. I actually, given that we started 15 minutes late, I took permission from the organizers to extend our session until 10:45 to give also the opportunities for Q&A. Just one thing that I see the interest in the room. So maybe I will start with ladies first, and we're gonna go to Aufa. Okay. Yeah, if you could please introduce yourself, and if you have a question for a specific panelist, please.
Hello.
Sure. Go ahead.
I'm Naami from Safer World. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment is, as I understand the analogy about the child and everything, but actually this is accountability from the donor side. It's not a parent-child relationship. The countries who initiated the war in Yemen, who participated in the war in Yemen, who before the war in Yemen have manipulated the system and the policies, they have responsibility against what is happening and accountability. So the work they're doing in humanitarian is a work of accountability, even though there's no acknowledge of previous mistakes and the current mistakes. That's what I wanted to say. The question is, when the decision for the, sorry, I'm really angry. The decision for the life-saving activities, were the civil society consulted during that? The civil society who's doing humanitarian and doing the soft work and doing all the non-life-saving activities. Is there any mitigation to help them, or to think about the risks that was shifted and doubled upon them because of the decision? Thank you.
Thank you, Aufa. And let me go to the first, please.
مصطفى نصر، رئيس مركز الدراسات والإعلام الاقتصادي وسكرتير فريق الإصلاحات الاقتصادية. شكرا جزيلا لكل المتحدثين، وأيضا شكرا لجهودهم الحقيقة في دعم العمل الإغاثي منذ 10 سنوات.
Or relief work for 10 years. Truly, the question after this period, 10 years of work, and now I believe what is important now, or we need an assessment, or what are the successes and failures after this decade. A decade is not a short period of time. The issue of transformation or shifting towards development, from relief to development, I believe this is the most urgent issue at this point in time. And I go back to the example Dr. Nadia gave on this child that is now 10 years old, the shift or working in relief and development, transitioning to development, it's like this child whose parents want to, he has needs, so perhaps he's going to go learn new things, entertainment and such, but he's given a phone or the TV is turned on for him to keep him away from or preoccupy him with these important things. So you keep him busy with humanitarian relief, whereas development is more important. The economic situation now is the worst phase for the Yemeni economy for 10 years. Inflation, a stop in exports, regression in assistance. This trilogy really makes now the suffering the most or the worst for 10 years. Yes, there was a war, but there was a flow of humanitarian aid. We exported oil. There was income coming into the country, but now the people are in the worst state possible. I wanted to make 2 points here. The first point, in the economic reform team, as an initiative by the private sector, we worked on it. The transition from relief to development, this is something we proposed in 2015. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of achievement that happened in that sphere, and one of the things was that there would be at least some areas, some zones that are stable, where we can work in partnership with the private sector to develop models. Now we've had the development, the UNDP, in cooperation with a lot of organizations to create TAIZ as a model according to the plan and transitioning from relief to development. And this is a wonderful initiative. We had hoped to see it at an earlier phase, but we also hope to work on it as an experience and to strengthen it so that it is applied in the rest of the governorate. My question to Dina at the World Bank, who is exerting really a lot of efforts along with Iman and all of the partners in attracting a lot of funding in view of this difficulties or the rare aid. Now the World Bank currently, is it planning to work directly with, or now as we've understood, the World Bank is working with the UN agencies. UN agencies typically take a lot of operational expenses for implementation, and this is according to some estimates could be 40%, 60% of the cost of the projects. What the people get is very small. So do they have the intention to work directly on direct development projects, which is what the World Bank was doing prior to the war? In practice. And the final point is the issue of governance, and I would conclude there. Governance of institutions, public institutions, and governance of the civil society. And I fear for the international organizations to stop their assistance. They were mostly in areas of control by Houthis. These institutions were stopped in areas that they are not allowed to work in. They were sentenced to collapse, and so we're starting from zero. So I believe this is part of the failure, and this is something that we need to note in the upcoming period.
Actually ask for shorter interventions so we can give the floor for more people and also give the chance to our panelists to respond. I see Abdul Saif at the back, and then we're going to come back to the front. Please, Abdul.
Abdul Saif, freelancer. Just I'll try to be very quick. I think the ecosystem for the aid globally has been distorted due to political agendas, and we've seen recently after the US elections, and it's going to get worse. Therefore, what Yemenis should be trying to think, I think, is to increase the efficiency of the little which they are receiving and to have multiplier. And I think we need to focus on that one so that to have an agenda how we can increase the efficiency of what we are receiving, no matter how little it is, but where we can invest, in which those investments can create jobs and can create economic growth at the local level. Over.
Thank you. One last question for this round. Hopefully we have another round, please.
شكرا جزيلا. الحقيقة كثر الحديث حول تأثير ال FTO على كل اليمنيين. هذا طبعا ما أكده أيضا هذا اليوم السيد شارلز بأن هناك تأثير على كل اليمنيين وبالذات في المناطق الشمالية.
السؤال هو
in the northern areas. The question is, the organizations that carry out these assistance activities, do they have an idea of what the exemptions or exceptions might look like, or any implementing mechanisms that will ensure that this designation does not have as big an impact? There are fears, not just among the public, but even the private sector has fears that the FTO would curb its activities, and so its banking activities, its transportation, and even expat remittances might be affected. We fear that in the end, the Houthis won't lose anything. Their smuggling routes are still open, they still are able to smuggle things through the sea, and then we discover at the end of the day that the impact or the brunt is fully on the people and the humanitarian situation. And so that's the first question. And the second question specifically for Mazen. You mentioned the limited activities that focus on development projects, and that most assistance is directed towards relief or humanitarian assistance, and this is a major imbalance. Does the private sector have a project or a strategy that it could provide to donors on very specific fields of activities in development projects that help create community partnership and work opportunities and become sustainable development? We understand that there still are organizations and institutions that work on development, like the Public Works Fund and the Social Fund for Development. But does the private sector have a vision or a perspective that can help benefit in this shift? And I think that this is something that the private sector can help do to the donor community. For funding for these kinds of projects.
We actually have 5 minutes left, so maybe let me start with Dina, given that a few questions were directed to you, and then we're going to move to the other panelists.
Okay.
Please, Dina.
So the questions I will try to answer. We do evaluate every single project that we implement once the project closes, and those evaluations are made public on our websites. They are specific to individual projects, but we also, every 2-3 years, have a new strategy that we come out with, which starts by looking back at what the achievements were of the previous strategy, and that is also something that is available for the public. In terms of this, I'm very interested to follow up with some of you, especially Dr. Nadia, but others, on this area-based approach that has been discussed here to focus potentially, not focus, but work with definitely not only at the national level, but also at the subnational level, so maybe individual governorates like Taz or Hadramaut or others. Those are the two that I always hear mentioned. But we at the World Bank, we don't want to ever do something that leads to any harm or any political ramifications that are unintentional. So, you know, we know that there's a very active conversation in the country about the relationship between governorates and the central government and so on. So we always keep that in mind in our programming. But I've heard now several people point to the need for area-based approaches. So it's something we are looking at. And then finally, in terms of working directly with the government, The issue is that, again, we are not a political, well, we cannot be very political institution. The point, our aim is to be able to reach every Yemeni who is in need. Right now, we don't know how best to work. So we work with the government, the internationally recognized government, in the sense that they come to our meetings, we discuss with them strategy, policy, but in terms of actually signing the legal agreements, which they cannot because they are not in charge of the whole country, we sign them with our UN partners. We are also at the same time building the capacity together with our colleagues in the UK and others, the Dutch, the Swiss, in terms of making sure that the government is as ready as possible to take over implementation of projects when the time comes. So it's this dual approach of trying to do the best thing we can under the current circumstances while building and preparing for the future, which is hopefully a peaceful one that brings development to all.
Thank you, Dina. Iman, the question for you on the role of civil society in your work.
Yeah, I think I would answer two questions. One, Aufa, she asked about the involvement of civil society in the decision-making process. And let me say that the decision to move to, the decision is not yet final. It is still under discussion, but it was put on the table during the Humanitarian Country Team Forum. For those of you who know, there's always representation from NGOs, national and international. So that was discussed in that forum. The final decision should come, in a week or 10 days. That's from on the life-saving, life-sustaining 4, 5 severity scale. On the FTO licenses, general licenses, if you asked me last week, I would have said no, there's no general licenses. But since you're asking me today, there is some talk about some general licenses. We don't know the scope of the general licenses. We don't know what they will include. We will have to wait until the 8th of March for them to be released. Thank you.
Mazen, there was a question directed to you on the private sector, if you have a plan that you could share with the international community to focus on areas for investments.
بالطبع في هناك أكثر من مصفوفة تم إعدادها خلال السنوات الماضية. يمكن الأخ مصطفى هنا أيضا ذكر لأنه ولم تكن هذه المصفوفات التي تم إعدادها كمجهود فردي فقط، وإنما كانت من قبل مثلا فريق الإصلاحات الاقتصادي الذي أنا برضو عضو فيها، منتدى رواد التنمية برضو أنا متواجد فيه، فكان أكثر من ورقة.
Forum, which I also am a member of, and so there are several papers and strategies that have been discussed by several entities that show very clearly what the fields and activities are that could be implemented in partnership with international and regional partners. And to be fair, one of the real challenges in creating these opportunities is not just international organizations, but there are also internal challenges. There are challenges from the state itself, from the public sector. The public sector still represents, still views themselves as the competitor of these projects after having proved their failure over more than 10 years, but they still pose this challenge and this threat to any new opportunities.
In less than half a minute, if you could respond to some of the issues that were raised in the room.
I think just on the FTO, we have the same information that we're more hopeful that there will be general licenses attached to that. the UK is leveraging all of its relationships to try and make sure that the FTO does take account of the fact that there are many needs inside Yemen. We should not be punishing the wrong people. We shouldn't be we shouldn't be putting the private sector at a disadvantage. We don't have perfect information at the moment, but that's where we are on that one. I mean, I think I would just like to maybe just say a couple of sort of very general comments about the whole conversation today and some of the challenges from within the panel as well, which I think are entirely justified. I mean, absolutely, we definitely need to start moving away from the emergency humanitarian response into development. We hear you on that, and we are endeavouring to do it, but it is challenging. And I think the main point I want to make is that you need to hold us to account as donors. But we have an expression, and Nadia's used a number today, but it takes two to tango, it takes two to dance. And there are responsibilities on both sides here to make sure that we move forward and do our very, very best for the Yemeni people, both in terms of how the Houthis behave in the north, but also the government of Yemen in the south. We need to have a strong government that is coherent, that is joined up, that is working together, so that we can do our very best to support the people inside the country. That would be my final point. Thank you.
Thank you. Nadia, in 10 seconds, final word.
I think it takes 4 to tango, because we're back to the Quad. So we need, because the government alone is not enough to be your partner, you need the private sector to actually do the work. You need the civil society to hold the government accountable, and you need the donors to actually facilitate in terms of capacity and money. So I think this new tango style is with 4.
Thank you. And maybe the final thing to leave our panelists with is to think towards having interventions that have multiplier effects in the country. And I will leave you with this point. And please join me in thanking our panelists, and a very quick round of applause. And thank you very much. Thank you.